Most people hear a number like $600,000 and immediately start doing mental math that feels a little discouraging. They think about rising prices, medical bills, long retirements, and suddenly that number feels smaller than it should. It feels fragile. It feels like something that could easily run out. And yet, quietly and consistently, there are retirees who start with around $600,000 and somehow, years later, they find themselves sitting on $2 million or more. Not because they won the lottery, not because they took wild risks, and not because they had some secret advantage. It happens in a much quieter way, a way that most people don't notice. And once you understand it, you realize it's not magic at all. It's a shift in how money behaves when time, discipline, and mindset finally work together. I've spent a long time reading stories from retirees, listening to financial planners talk about their clients, and watching real people explain how their retirement unfolded very differently than they expected. What stands out isn't brilliance or perfect timing. What stands out is patience. What stands out is restraint. And what stands out most of all is how retirement changes the relationship people have with money in ways they never anticipated. One man shared that when he retired, he was convinced his $600,000 was a ticking clock. He described the early years of retirement as stressful, even though he had no debt and modest expenses. Every market dip felt personal. Every unexpected bill felt like a warning sign. But over time, something interesting happened. His spending settled, his fear faded, and his portfolio, instead of shrinking, began to quietly grow. He didn't chase returns. He didn't overhaul his strategy. He simply stayed invested, lived within his means, and gave his money time to do what it had always done best when left alone. This is the part most people misunderstand about retirement. They imagine it as the phase where money only goes one direction, out. But for many retirees, especially those who planned conservatively, retirement becomes a period of slow accumulation rather than decline. Expenses often drop more than expected, big purchases fade away, commuting disappears, lifestyle inflation stops, and the money that remains invested is suddenly given something it rarely gets during working years: stability. During a career, money is constantly being interrupted. New expenses, bigger homes, kids, emergencies, lifestyle upgrades that feel justified because income is still coming in. In retirement, that cycle often breaks. One woman explained that once she stopped working, she realized how many of her expenses were tied directly to her job. Clothing, eating out, convenience spending, stress spending. When those disappeared, her monthly needs were far lower than she ever modeled on paper. She was withdrawing less than expected, and the rest of her portfolio stayed intact. And that's where compounding quietly takes over. Compounding doesn't need excitement. It doesn't need perfect timing. It just needs time and consistency. A retiree with $600,000 who withdraws modestly and keeps the rest invested in a balanced portfolio doesn't need extraordinary returns to see meaningful growth. Even average returns, combined with limited withdrawals, can create outcomes that surprise people, especially over 10, 15, or 20 years.
Another retiree shared that he expected to draw down his investments steadily, but instead found himself withdrawing only what dividends and interest already provided. The principal stayed mostly untouched. Over time, the portfolio grew simply because it was never asked to work very hard. He described it as finally letting money rest instead of constantly putting it under pressure. There's also an emotional shift that happens in retirement that rarely gets talked about. People become less reactive. During working years, market volatility feels threatening because income and investments are tied to identity, productivity, and future security all at once. In retirement, once a routine settles in, many people stop checking their accounts obsessively. They stop making emotional decisions. They stop panicking. And, ironically, that calm behavior often leads to better long-term results. One financial advisor mentioned that his most successful retiree clients weren't the ones with the highest IQs or the most aggressive strategies. They were the ones who did almost nothing. They rebalanced occasionally. They stuck to simple allocations. They didn't chase headlines. And year after year, the numbers moved in the right direction. Another key reason 600,000 can turn into 2 million is longevity combined with underspending. Many retirees are far more frugal than they need to be. They overestimate future expenses and underestimate how adaptable they'll become. Travel slows down, desires simplify. Happiness becomes less tied to spending and more tied to routine, relationships, and health. That gap between what they could spend and what they actually do spend becomes the engine that keeps their investments growing. One woman admitted that she was almost afraid to enjoy her money at first. She lived well below her means because she didn't want to make a mistake. Over time, she realized she had been far too cautious. By the time she felt comfortable spending more, her portfolio had already grown substantially. What she once feared losing had multiplied simply because she didn't touch it. There's also the effect of delayed claiming strategies. Many retirees delay Social Security or pensions, using their savings sparingly in the early years. When guaranteed income kicks in later, it often covers most or all living expenses, reducing the need to withdraw from investments at all. At that point, the portfolio becomes more of a long-term growth engine than a spending account. This creates a strange but powerful dynamic. The money that was supposed to be spent ends up being preserved, and the longer it stays preserved, the more it grows. It's not dramatic, it's not fast, but it's relentless.
Another man explained that the biggest surprise of retirement wasn't financial hardship, but financial stability. Once the unknowns became known, once routines formed, once income sources were clear, his anxiety dropped sharply. And with it, his urge to do something with his investments disappeared. That inaction turned out to be the best decision he ever made. It's also worth mentioning that many retirees underestimate how long they'll remain mentally and physically capable of managing their finances. They imagine a steep decline that forces major decisions early. In reality, many stay sharp for decades. That allows them to adjust gradually, optimize taxes, manage withdrawals efficiently, and avoid costly mistakes that destroy compounding. Taxes play a role here too. Strategic withdrawals, Roth conversions, and tax-efficient investing can quietly preserve more money than people expect. A few percentage points saved every year compounds just like returns do. Over long periods, those savings become enormous. One retiree described learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to withdraw money in a way that minimized taxes. He didn't master it overnight. He just improved a little each year. Looking back, he realized that the money he didn't give away unnecessarily was a major contributor to his portfolio's growth. And then there's time itself. Retirement is often longer than people assume, but that length works both ways. Yes, money needs to last, but it also has more time to grow. A portfolio that remains invested for 20 or 30 years after retirement isn't a static thing. It's alive. It's still compounding. And if it's not being drained aggressively, it can reach numbers that once seemed impossible. This is why the story of retirees turning 600,000 to 2 million isn't about luck or genius. It's about alignment. When spending, psychology, time, and patience finally line up, money behaves very differently than it does during working life. And this is just the beginning of the picture, because beyond market returns and spending habits, there are deeper behavioral patterns, lifestyle shifts, and structural advantages in retirement that quietly accelerate this outcome even further. As retirement settles in, something subtle but powerful begins to happen beneath the surface. The urgency that once drove financial decisions starts to fade. There's no next promotion to plan for, no salary increase to anticipate, no pressure to keep up with anyone else.
And in that quieter mental space, money starts behaving differently. Not because the markets change, but because the retiree does. One of the most overlooked reasons retirees with $600,000 end up with $2 million is that they stop sabotaging themselves. During working years, people often make decisions based on stress, comparison, and fear of falling behind. They buy high because everyone else is excited. They sell low because panic feels unbearable. In retirement, especially after the first few years, many people finally break that cycle. They stop reacting and start observing. A retiree once described it as finally stepping off a treadmill they didn't realize they were on. For decades, every financial move felt urgent. In retirement, urgency dissolves. Bills are predictable, income sources are clear, life becomes smaller in a good way. And when decisions slow down, mistakes become less frequent. This calmer behavior alone can account for massive differences in long-term outcomes. Avoiding just a handful of bad decisions over 20 years can mean the difference between barely getting by and quietly accumulating wealth. Another important shift happens around risk perception. Many retirees assume they should become extremely conservative, but what actually happens for successful ones is more nuanced. They don't eliminate risk, they redefine it. They begin to see inflation, taxes, and inactivity as risks too. So instead of pulling everything into cash or ultra-low yield investments, they keep a portion of their money working, not aggressively, but consistently. One woman shared that she initially planned to move everything into safe investments, but after talking to others who had been retired longer, she realized that safety wasn't about avoiding volatility entirely. It was about ensuring she wouldn't outlive her money. That realization changed how she invested, and over time, it changed her results dramatically. There's also a structural advantage retirees gain that doesn't exist during working years: flexibility. When you're no longer tied to a job, your expenses become more adjustable. You can choose when to travel, when to spend, and when to pause. That flexibility allows retirees to naturally spend less during market downturns and more during strong years, often without consciously trying to time anything. This gentle responsiveness preserves capital in ways rigid plans never can.
One retiree explained that during market declines, she instinctively spent more time at home, cooked more meals, and delayed discretionary purchases. She didn't see it as a sacrifice, it just felt natural. When markets rebounded, she resumed travel and hobbies without guilt. Her portfolio benefited from that rhythm, even though she never planned it that way. Another factor that quietly pushes $600,000 toward $2 million is the absence of large, recurring financial shocks. By retirement, many people have eliminated mortgages, paid off cars, and reduced dependence. That means fewer surprises, fewer emergencies that require pulling large sums from investments at the worst possible times. During working years, one unexpected event can derail years of progress. In retirement, stability becomes the norm. That stability protects compounding. Healthcare is often cited as the big unknown, but many retirees find that once Medicare and supplemental plans are in place, expenses become far more predictable than expected. It's not that costs disappear, but they become manageable and budgetable. That predictability removes another source of panic-driven financial decisions. One man admitted that he spent years fearing healthcare costs, only to realize later that his largest expenses were behind him, not ahead. That realization allowed him to relax and let his investments continue growing instead of hoarding cash unnecessarily. There's also the psychological impact of gratitude and sufficiency. Many retirees reach a point where they feel they have enough. That feeling changes everything. When you stop striving for more, you paradoxically end up with more. Spending becomes intentional rather than habitual. Purchases are made because they add value, not because they fill a void. This mindset reduces waste in ways spreadsheets can't capture. It's not about extreme frugality, it's about clarity. knowing what matters and letting go of what doesn't.
Another retiree shared that in his working years, he spent money to cope with stress. In retirement, the stress disappeared, and so did the spending. The money he once used to decompress simply stayed invested instead. And then there's time. Time does more than compound money. It compounds behavior. Good habits reinforce themselves. Simple strategies prove themselves over years, building confidence. Confidence reduces tinkering. Reduced tinkering leads to better results. It's a quiet feedback loop that rewards patience. A financial planner once noted that retirees who survived their first major market downturn without panic became nearly unshakable afterward. Having lived through volatility and come out fine, they stopped fearing it. That fearlessness, or rather calm acceptance, allowed them to stay invested through cycles that others couldn't tolerate. Another overlooked element is that many retirees receive unexpected inflows later in life. Inheritances, property sales, downsizing proceeds, or delayed benefits often arrive years into retirement, not at the beginning. These additions can significantly boost net worth, especially when they're invested rather than spent. One woman described selling her family home 10 years into retirement and moving into a smaller, more manageable space. The equity she released felt like found money. Instead of spending it, she invested it conservatively. That single decision added years of financial security and accelerated her portfolio growth. Downsizing itself is a powerful but often emotional decision. Many retirees hold on to large homes longer than necessary, not realizing how much capital is tied up. When they finally make the move, the financial impact can be transformative. Lower expenses combined with higher investable assets create a powerful compounding effect. Another man explained that once he moved into a smaller home, his utility bills dropped, maintenance costs vanished, and his stress level plummeted. The money he saved every month stayed invested, quietly working for him year after year. There's also the role of identity. In retirement, people stop defining themselves by income. That shift removes a lot of ego-driven financial behavior. There's less need to signal success, less pressure to keep appearances. That freedom allows money to stay where it belongs, growing instead of being spent to prove something. This is why so many retirees are shocked when they look at their accounts a decade into retirement and realize they have more than they started with. It's not because they plan to get rich, it's because they plan to live well and let the rest take care of itself. And this pattern repeats over and over. Quiet spending, consistent investing, emotional stability, flexibility, time. None of it is dramatic on its own, but together they create outcomes that feel almost unbelievable to those still in the accumulation phase. And there's still more to this story, because beyond behavior and lifestyle, there are strategic decisions retirees make, sometimes unknowingly, that further amplify these results. As the years pass in retirement, another quiet transformation takes place. The way retirees think about ownership begins to change. What once felt like something to be spent down now starts to feel like something to be stewarded, not necessarily for heirs, but for peace of mind. And that shift in perspective subtly alters how money is treated. Many retirees stop seeing their portfolio as a countdown clock and start seeing it as a living system, a system that can support them, adapt with them, and even grow alongside them. That mental shift alone can prevent a long list of costly mistakes. When money is no longer viewed as fragile, people stop overhandling it. One retiree explained that early on, he obsessed over the perfect withdrawal rate. He ran simulations constantly. He adjusted his plan every time the market moved. Years later, he laughed at how much mental energy he wasted. What actually mattered was consistency. He withdrew reasonably, adjusted when needed, and let the rest ride. Over time, his portfolio did exactly what portfolios tend to do when they're not interfered with. Another key reason $600,000 grows into $2 million is the way retirees unknowingly reduce sequence of returns risk.
This risk is often described in technical terms, but in real life it's softened by behavior. Retirees naturally spend less in the early years than they think they will. They delay large purchases. They ease into retirement rather than jumping into an expensive lifestyle immediately. That restraint protects the portfolio during its most vulnerable period. By the time spending increases or unexpected costs arise, the portfolio has often already recovered or grown. What looks like caution at the beginning turns out to be one of the most powerful long-term strategies. One woman shared that she planned several big trips right after retiring, but ended up postponing them. She wanted time to adjust, to see how retirement felt. By the time she was ready to travel more, her investments had already grown significantly. The money she didn't rush to spend became the foundation for years of freedom later. There's also a growing awareness among retirees of the value of simplicity. Complex financial products, frequent trading, and constant optimization lose their appeal. Simplicity reduces errors. Fewer moving parts mean fewer things to break. This simplicity often leads to lower fees, fewer taxes, and more consistent returns. A retiree once said that his best financial decision in retirement was doing less. He consolidated accounts, simplified investments, and stopped chasing strategies. The result wasn't just better numbers, but better sleep. And better sleep leads to better decisions, which leads to better outcomes.
Another underestimated factor is social influence. Retirees often spend more time around people who are content rather than competitive. Conversations shift away from earnings and possessions toward health, hobbies, and relationships. This social environment reinforces modest spending and long-term thinking. One man noted that when he was working, conversations revolved around raises, bonuses, and new purchases. In retirement, the conversations changed. People talked about walks, grandchildren, books, and gardens. Spending lost its status value. That cultural shift made it easier to live simply without feeling deprived. There's also the impact of routines. Retirement routines tend to be low cost and high value. Daily walks, reading, cooking, volunteering, visiting friends. These activities provide fulfillment without draining finances. Over time, retirees realize that the most satisfying parts of life often cost very little. This realization fundamentally changes how money is used. Instead of being the source of happiness, money becomes the protector of time and freedom. When money is treated as a tool rather than a goal, it tends to last longer and grow more steadily. Another powerful contributor is that many retirees underestimate their own resilience. They assume that any reduction in spending will feel painful. In reality, humans adapt quickly. Retirees adjust their expectations, find alternatives, and often discover that less is enough. That adaptability reduces the need to draw heavily from investments. One woman shared that when her portfolio dipped during a market downturn, she worried about having to cut back. What surprised her was how little she missed the things she delayed. She found joy in simpler routines and realized she had been overspending before without noticing. There's also the role of legacy thinking, even among those who don't plan to leave large inheritances. The idea of not being a burden, of having options later in life, or of being able to help family if needed, encourages conservative spending. That restraint preserves capital, which then compounds. A retiree once said that knowing he could help his children in an emergency gave him peace, even though he never actually needed to. That peace allowed him to remain calm during market volatility and avoid rash decisions. Tax efficiency becomes more powerful over time as well. Small, consistent tax decisions compound just like returns. Retirees who gradually learn how to manage required distributions, optimize account types, and time income streams often keep more of their money working for them. One man described learning slowly how to structure withdrawals so that his taxable income stayed within favorable ranges.
It wasn't perfect. He made adjustments year by year. But over 2 decades, the cumulative savings were substantial. That money stayed invested instead of being lost to unnecessary taxes.
Another factor is that retirees often become more patient investors. Without the pressure of accumulating quickly, they accept average returns. And average returns, sustained over long periods, are incredibly powerful. The desire for excitement fades. Consistency becomes the goal. This patience also helps retirees avoid the temptation to overreact to financial media. Headlines lose their grip when daily life is fulfilling and stable. Market noise becomes background static rather than a call to action. One retiree admitted that he stopped watching financial news altogether, not out of ignorance, but out of self-awareness. He knew that constant exposure made him anxious. By stepping away, he protected his long-term strategy and his peace of mind. And then there's the simple math of time again. Even modest growth rates double and triple money over decades. A portfolio that grows quietly at a reasonable rate while being lightly tapped can reach numbers that seem impossible when viewed only from the starting point. This is why the story of retirees turning $600,000 into $2 million isn't rare among those who live long, stable retirements. It's not a trick. It's the natural result of alignment between lifestyle, psychology, and time. But there's one final layer to this story, one that ties everything together and explains why this outcome is far more common than people realize. By the time retirees look back and realize that $600,000 has quietly turned into $2 million, the outcome no longer feels shocking. It feels earned, it feels logical, and most of all, it feels calm. The growth didn't come from brilliance or constant effort. It came from letting life settle and allowing money to follow that same rhythm. At this stage in retirement, many people stop thinking in terms of maximizing and start thinking in terms of sustaining. That shift removes the final source of financial stress. When the goal is no longer to win, but simply to continue, the pressure disappears, and without pressure, mistakes become rare. One retiree explained that once he accepted that his lifestyle was stable and his needs were covered, he stopped checking his accounts frequently. Months would go by without a glance, and when he did look, he often found that his balance was higher than before, not because he was trying to grow it, but because he wasn't interfering with it. This is where the power of non-action becomes clearest. The absence of panic, the absence of urgency, and the absence of ego allow compounding to do its work uninterrupted. Money thrives in quiet environments. Retirement, when approached thoughtfully, creates exactly that.
Another important element is that retirees often experience fewer identity-driven expenses. During working life, spending is often tied to image, status, and professional expectations. In retirement, those pressures vanish. There's no need to impress colleagues or maintain a certain appearance. Clothing, transportation, and entertainment choices simplify. That simplification keeps expenses low without feeling restrictive. One woman shared that after retiring, she stopped buying things she once thought were necessities, not because she couldn't afford them, but because she realized she didn't need them. Her satisfaction increased even as her spending decreased. The money she didn't spend stayed invested, quietly growing year after year. There's also the emotional security that comes from knowing time is finally yours. That security reduces impulsive behavior. People no longer feel the need to reward themselves for surviving stressful weeks or difficult days. When life itself becomes calmer, spending loses its emotional charge. Another retiree described how, in his working years, shopping felt like relief. In retirement, relief came from walks, conversations, and rest. His expenses dropped naturally, without effort or discipline. That natural decline in spending preserved his portfolio far more effectively than any strict budget ever could. Over time, retirees also become better judges of what truly improves their quality of life. They spend intentionally on comfort, health, and meaningful experiences, while cutting out things that add little value. This selective spending leads to high satisfaction at relatively low cost. One man shared that he invested in a comfortable chair, good walking shoes, and a few hobbies he genuinely loved. Those purchases brought daily joy. Meanwhile, he stopped spending on things that once filled his calendar but never his spirit. His financial life became simpler and more aligned. This alignment creates a powerful reinforcing loop. When spending aligns with values, regret disappears. Without regret, there's no urge to compensate or overcorrect. Financial behavior becomes steady, predictable, and sustainable. Another reason 600,000 grows into 2 million is that retirees often benefit from delayed gratification without even trying. They delay large expenses simply because they're no longer in a rush. There's always tomorrow. That patience allows money to stay invested longer, which is exactly what compounding needs. A retiree once said that the biggest gift of retirement was time. Time to think, time to choose, time to wait. That waiting, repeated over years, turned out to be incredibly profitable. There's also the role of perspective. As retirees age, money becomes less about accumulation and more about optionality. Knowing they can handle emergencies, help family, or adapt to changes brings peace. That peace reduces fear-based decisions that often destroy wealth.
One woman explained that once she realized she could handle almost any scenario that came her way, she stopped worrying about optimizing every dollar. That freedom allowed her portfolio to grow because she stopped disrupting it. Even market downturns take on a different meaning. Instead of threats, they become temporary phases. Retirees who have lived through multiple cycles understand that volatility is part of the process, not a sign of failure. This understanding prevents selling at the worst possible times. A man who retired before a major market downturn shared that the experience taught him patience. He watched his portfolio fall and then recover. Years later, he credited that experience with giving him confidence that carried him through every fluctuation afterward. That confidence kept him invested, which made all the difference. Another often overlooked factor is that retirees become better at distinguishing between needs and wants. Needs are predictable and manageable. Wants become fewer and more intentional. This clarity simplifies financial planning and reduces stress. One retiree said that once she separated what she truly needed from what she merely wanted, everything became easier. Her withdrawals became smaller, her investments grew larger, and her peace of mind improved. There's also the quiet power of gratitude. Many retirees feel grateful for what they have rather than focused on what they lack. Gratitude reduces consumption. It fosters contentment, and contentment is one of the strongest protectors of wealth. When people are content, they don't chase, they don't overreact, they don't feel the need to constantly adjust. They allow systems to work, and systems, given enough time, tend to outperform impulses. This is why the story of retirees ending up with more money than they started with is far more common than people expect. It's not because they outsmarted the market, it's because they stopped fighting it. They aligned their lives with their values, reduced unnecessary friction, and let time do its work. $600,000 doesn't become $2 million overnight. It becomes $2 million quietly, year by year, decision by decision, or often by the decision not to decide at all. And the most important takeaway from all of this isn't the number. It's the realization that retirement doesn't have to be a period of decline. It can be a period of stability, growth, and confidence, a time when money finally serves life instead of controlling it. For many retirees, the true wealth isn't the final balance. It's the calm that comes from knowing they lived well, spent wisely, and allowed their resources to support them without fear. The money grew because their lives were simplified, and in that simplicity, they found abundance.
If this perspective resonated with you, feel free to reflect on your own expectations about retirement. Sometimes the future isn't smaller than we imagine. Sometimes it's quieter, and quieter, it turns out, can be incredibly powerful. Thank you for being here and taking the time to listen.